The role of women in the Catholic Church has been debated for decades. Critics of church policy claim women have been systematically denied their rightful place in the church hierarchy, while the church itself insists that women are an essential part of its work. Today, we will look at the tremendous contributions women have made to the church throughout its history and examine how their role has changed over the centuries. I'm Carolyn Morrison, welcoming you to another episode of Mysteries of the Church.
Women are clearly included in the groups of disciples, but they are also just as clearly not included among the symbolic numberings that the gospel writers give us of the 12 apostles, the 70 disciples, although we don't know for certain, mentioned in Luke. So women are clearly disciples. They are just as clearly not included among the 12 who occupy symbolic positions of leadership.
We know that women were among Jesus' disciples, and that even as Jesus traveled from village to village and ultimately from Galilee to Jerusalem, women accompanied him.
We know from the Gospels that Jesus had women disciples, women followers who followed him, who Luke says ministered to him, provided for him. Probably some of them had some means, some money, so they helped feed Jesus and the apostles.
Women not only followed Jesus, but also then were part of the community of faith that emerges very visibly at Pentecost. Mary and the other women are mentioned as being present with the disciples as they hide and then are empowered by the Spirit to proclaim the gospel in Jerusalem and beyond.
Women influenced not only other women, but also men as well, because they were all working together for the same purpose of evangelization. So I think that women and men were working together in terms of spreading the gospel and affecting the whole population, you might say, not just simply a specific segment of the population.
Jesus was a Jew, and as a Jew, he lived in a society that had religious rules and culture that was very strong. And Judaism, the faith that was his, comes through the Jewish tradition through women. It came to him through his mother.
And of course, we can't forget that the most perfect human being that ever lived, that we affirm in the Christian faith, is a woman, is the mother of Jesus.
Jesus' mother, Mary, she was the greatest disciple of all, the one who heard and received his word fully. She's the most prominent and most powerful first among the disciples.
And so the devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary is a very, very early and integral part of Christianity, and it helped to soften the attitudes toward women and to bring them into a more equal social place with men.
We have, even in the letters of Paul, we have the famous saying that was probably spoken at baptisms: there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
Christianity had a tremendous appeal in its first 200 or 300 years to women, even though this was a time of persecution, a time of social unrest for Christians. Women were attracted to this faith. Why is that? The best answer that I've seen so far is that Christianity afforded women a set of social protections and safety that the pagan religions did not.
A good example of this is that some in the community in Corinth, some of the women begin to remove their head coverings or their veils, which they would have traditionally worn in society, in worship. They take them off. And when we think, why were they doing that? We think maybe they were thinking of this famous baptism verse, no longer male or female. So they were enacting this kind of unity and oneness of their baptism.
Jesus and his message offered women a new and important place, both in their relationship with God and their role in society. Far from the second-class status women were accustomed to, Jesus offered them salvation as well as equality. But would the role of women in the church continue to expand in the centuries after Christ? Find out when Mysteries of the Church returns in just a moment. The role of women within the body of the church has changed dramatically over the 20 centuries since Christ walked among us. This is hardly surprising, since society itself is radically different than it was 2,000 years ago. But what part would they play in the organization of the church in the first centuries after Christ? The answer would prove to be challenging and surprising, both for the church and for the women themselves.
We have to remember that in the first century, the structures of the church were somewhat fluid, and we have to be careful not to imagine that the church in the first century was completely like the church today. The New Testament doesn't give us all that much clarity, except to say that men and women were involved in evangelizing and in serving the community.
Women seem to be more involved in roles that are supportive of the church's liturgy and liturgical life, but women are also at this point doing something rather new and innovative, and that is founding their own somewhat independent religious communities.
They probably had broadly conceived leadership roles in the Christian community of faith. We know that in earliest communities there were women with the gift of prophecy.
But I think if you look at the epistles and the Acts, there are 3 women, for instance, who come up that are who are very interesting. I mean, there are Dorcas, Lydia, and Phoebe. These women had particular responsibilities given to them by Paul for shaping the church in various parts of Asia. These are not people who are hiding in the shadows. They are women in their society who are shaping the culture, the church that was their church at the time.
Ascetic communities of both women and men begin to emerge in the middle of the 3rd century. Initially not in what we would now call convents or monasteries, but in either ascetic households. A woman might gather her sisters and her mother and simply decide to run the household as an ascetic community of faith.
When the early Christians started going into the desert and engaging in a lot of ascetic practices, that one of the things that happened was that women were able to participate in that alongside of men.
It's at that time, 2nd and 3rd centuries, that we begin to see the roles of women defined and restricted, and the leadership roles in the church defined in terms of gender, and that continues until the 4th century, when we have a well-established institution that can go public.
What began, you might say, in the early church as communities coming together in a spontaneous way and living together and praying together and working together, that gradually moved into what today are the more structured religious orders.
So there were communities of women that grew up in cities and towns, also out in the desert, because in the 4th, 5th centuries of the church you had this huge growth of monastic life, and both men and women went to the deserts and founded communities. But it was more difficult for women to support themselves economically, financially, in urban centers. So you had women who were founding groups, communities of women which grew into female monasteries, convents, and enabled women to exercise an independent life within the early church, which was also supportive of the growth of the early church.
A convent for a woman was a place where she could enter a walled society where the norms inside those walls were far more conducive to her discovery of full personhood than the norms outside those walls. So we do have, even in the very early Middle Ages, instances of women who were the head of religious communities that also included men or avowed male religious in various ways.
I think St. Francis, now for example, was a very charismatic figure and gathered disciples around himself, but women were attracted to his message and his ministry as well. Prominent among them, of course, was St. Clare. And St. Clare then went on to become the founders of what are called the Poor Clares, a community dedicated to contemplative prayer.
I think St. Clare is a fascinating example. You know, she, like Francis, I mean, these were people who were well-to-do members of society. She was completely compelled by the religious vision of Francis. He invited her to join a community. He gave her this small house and said she could come there. She had given up all of her possessions, much to the consternation of her family, just as it was much to the consternation of his when he did the same.
With Clare, for example, we could tell her story as a strong woman who chooses to embody Francis's particular charism to suit the particular subject position of women.
Toward the end of the Middle Ages, women want to serve in a very public way. They don't want to be confined to a particular convent, but rather they want to be out there in the streets among the people. They want to heal the sick, they want to teach, they want to serve the poor.
I think if we look through the history of the church, that would lead us to say that new orders will continue to emerge because new needs emerge. And some orders have emerged, met a need, and then dissolved. I think we should admit that that's a possibility too.
But I also think in the church, we need as a community to talk about how important nuns will be and sisters will be for the future, and not just talk about the good nuns of the past.
I think sisters have always been a fascinating and vibrant and energizing part of the church's life. My goodness, where would the Catholic Church be without its sisters, and the breadth of charisms and gifts and challenges they have taken on?
I would say that in 2050, religious life in the United States for women is going to look more like it did in 1950 than it did in 1985. And that's because the communities that are growing and that are attracting young women are communities that are in habit, who live in community, pray in community, have community-based institutional ministries.
For more than 15 centuries, convents provided women with opportunities unparalleled in the outside world. And today, the importance of nuns and sisters is just as challenging and rewarding as it was in the past. Join us for the next segment, when we will look at the amazing lives of just a few of the many thousands of women whose lives have helped shape and mold the life of the Church. As women's role in the life and work of the church grew and expanded, it was inevitable that some of them achieved special levels of recognition. There have been thousands of women who dedicated themselves to the work of Christ and His church, sometimes sacrificing their lives in the process. Many dedicated women have made extraordinary contributions to the life of the church and the betterment of society as a whole.
I think one of the more interesting women that we encounter in Scripture is Mary Magdalene. And she's interesting not only for who she was, the first person to see the risen Christ, but also because of historically what we've done to her. We don't know a lot about her.
She's a woman identified by her city. Mary Magdalene comes from Mary of Magdala, probably a fishing village. This is odd because in biblical times women are typically identified either by whom they are married to, or whose mother they are, or whose daughter they are. So for her to be identified by a city has led scholars to think that this woman was independently wealthy.
In every gospel, she's the one who finds the empty tomb, who first bears witness to the resurrection. In several accounts in the Bible, she is the one who receives the first experience of Jesus after he's been resurrected.
The risen Lord appears to her and commands her to bring the news of the resurrection to his apostles. So as a result, she gets titled the Apostle to the Apostles.
She is someone who rallies the apostles together when they're distraught, they're fearful for their lives. She is one who is considered to have the true teachings of Jesus. And this shows up enough times in these ancient texts that catch our attention and make us think, she really must have been important.
Like all early followers of Jesus, Mary Magdalene was a Jew who incorporated Christ's teachings into her own faith. While most women in the later years of the church were born into Christianity, one of the bravest and most important Catholic women of the 20th century was also a convert from Judaism to Catholicism. Her name was Edith Stein.
People should be aware of Edith Stein because she's a wonderful example of someone in whom so many different backgrounds and vocations can come together. She had an intellectual vocation, she had a religious vocation. She brings together and creates a kind of rapprochement between our Jewish roots as Catholics and our Catholic faith.
At the beginning of the 1920s, while on vacation, read the autobiography of Teresa of Avila, and she wanted to enter the Carmelite order. So she taught for a number of years until the Nazis rose to power, and as a Jew, she lost her teaching position.
So she actually secretly went to another convent in Holland in the hope of escaping the menace of Nazism in Germany, but unfortunately a short time after that, that country was conquered.
As the Nazi noose tightens around Jews, the Nazis end up in 1942 rounding up in the Netherlands all Jews, even those who had converted to Catholicism or had become Protestants or whatever. She was gassed apparently soon after arriving in Auschwitz, but we don't know the day. There are no remains of her body. She went up in smoke.
St. Edith Stein sacrificed her life for her beliefs, but fortunately, martyrdom is not an essential part of giving one's life to Christ. Like many thousands of other women of devout faith, Mother Teresa lived a long life dedicated entirely to her belief that helping the poor is an integral part of serving Christ.
Well, I think that Mother Teresa was so influential because she was a woman of great conviction, of great persuasion, and her deep convictions led people to want to follow her.
She was born in what is now Albania, felt a call to a missionary life, and she took the name Teresa in memory of Thérèse de Lisieux, who is the patroness of missions. Mother Teresa at some point feels the Spirit move her outside of her comfort zone, and so she leaves her order to be there and with the destitute. Her vision catches on, a number of women gather around her, and she founds a new order dedicated to sheltering the most destitute. And by now we have, I think, close to 750 houses of the Missionaries of Charity in 150 countries. So this small order initially has certainly grown like wildfire.
And you didn't have to be Catholic or even Christian to look at her and see her as a living saint, as an example of moral excellence. We're used to reading about saints in the pages of history books and hearing about them maybe in the liturgy. We got to watch a saint in action when we saw her, when we heard her give addresses and give lectures. So, I mean, she's compelling because she's kind of the saint we all grew up with.
Mary Magdalene, Edith Stein, and Mother Teresa will always serve as an example of the importance of women in fulfilling God's plan. But what will the future generations of women do who feel the call to serve? In the next segment, we will learn how today's women are involved in the church. So stay with us. Mysteries of the Church will be right back. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the role of women in society has been changing at an ever-increasing pace. In 1920, women gained the right to vote, and in 1972, they were protected from discrimination by the Equal Rights Amendment. Unquestionably, women should not be discriminated against. But what is the future role of women in the church?
I would say that the church's discernment, which, I mean, with John Paul II was given very authoritatively, has been that women are not called to ordained ministry, but it is not because women are unequal, that women are somehow less than men, which unfortunately has been argued in the past. It's because the church has discerned that women's gifts ought to be exercised in a different way, in another way.
There are more well-educated, professionally gifted Catholic women than there have ever been in the history of the church. Why did we have the ability in the past, through religious orders, to have women in leadership on every level in institutions, and now we seem to be falling behind? I mean, I think that that's a real and pressing question.
It's one of the things that's true, I think, in every century, is that even with every move to make the church more patriarchal, there are always women who are there as visionaries, as leaders, as people with what we call charismatic authority, that even through unofficial channels manage to teach or express the truth that they feel and that they've received from God.
I think that today we see parishes that are very much alive because of the collaboration of priests and religious women and lay women and laymen and lay women, so that where you have strong teams working together, that contributes to the vitality of a parish.
The church is only complete when the image of God in it is complete. The opening chapter of Genesis tells us that male and female together are the image of God. The church needs that full image, both men and women together, to be fully the image of God and to be fully the body of Christ.
I think the thing that made religious women in the sisterhoods so powerful was that they had a kind of faith that was so rich and true. Their love of the Eucharist. They had religious formation that was tremendous. They were consistently and constantly in prayer, in community. That it is how we practice the faith that will make our leadership different.
Through 2,000 years of church history, countless dedicated women have changed the lives of millions of believers and non-believers. In the future, the role of women in the Catholic Church will continue to grow and expand. As sons and daughters of the Church, it is our duty to fulfill our obligations to both Christ and His Church with dedication and a joyous heart, because only then is our burden lifted and our lives made whole. Thank you for joining us. I'm Carolyn Morrison, and I hope to see you next week on Mysteries of the Church.